The woods were quiet that morning, too quiet for a place that was supposed to be alive. The mist hung low between the pines, and the air carried the heavy scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like old blood. Eliza always said that the silence of those woods felt like a held breath, waiting, listening. She had grown up in that silence, in a wooden house that leaned slightly to one side, its windows nailed shut and its doors locked from the inside. Her world ended where the tree line began, and beyond that line, her mother said, lived demons who would steal her soul if she ever wandered too far. But the real demons were inside the house. Her mother spoke in whispers, her hands always trembling as she lit the candles before Samuel's chair. He was her older brother, tall, pale, and silent, with eyes too dark for someone so young. "He's the chosen one," her mother would murmur. "The Lord sent him to us when the world turned away." And Eliza believed it, because belief was all she had. Every night, she would kneel beside Samuel's feet as her family hummed in prayer, their voices quivering, their bodies shaking as if caught between fear and worship. The candles burned lower each night, and Samuel's shadow stretched longer across the room, crawling like a living thing. Sometimes, Eliza thought she saw it move even when he didn't. Sometimes, when everyone else was asleep, she heard him whisper through the cracks in the walls, soft, soothing, promising that one day she would understand her purpose. It was on one of those nights that she saw something in the mirror, her reflection smiling when she wasn't. Behind her stood Samuel, eyes gleaming in the dim light, a faint grin cutting across his face. And in that grin, in that unholy stillness, Eliza felt the truth begin to claw its way out of the dark corners of her mind. Something in that house wasn't human. And it wanted her to believe. Eliza was born deep within the Appalachian woods, in a cabin so far from civilization that no one in the nearest town even knew it existed. Her world began and ended with the thick trees that surrounded her home like sentinels, their twisted branches whispering secrets she was never meant to hear. Her parents told her that the world beyond the forest was full of sin and corruption, that outsiders would steal her soul and feed her to the devil if she ever dared to leave. So she grew up believing that the forest was her protector, her keeper, and her prison all at once. The days bled together in silence, broken only by the sounds of creaking wood, the wind pushing against the cabin walls, and her mother's voice humming hymns that never seemed to end. There was no laughter, no schooling, no friends, only rules, chores, and prayers that always ended with Samuel's name. Her brother Samuel was everything in that house. Her parents spoke of him with reverence, their eyes soft but fearful, as though he were something sacred and dangerous. To Eliza, he was a mystery, older, quiet, and distant, always sitting by the window and staring into the woods. He never played with her, never spoke much, but when he did, his voice carried an authority that made her tremble. Their mother called him the light of the Lord, and their father said Samuel had been born with a mark that proved he was chosen. Eliza had never seen this mark, but she had seen how their mother knelt before him during prayer, whispering blessings as though he were not her son but her savior. The isolation of her upbringing made belief easy and doubt impossible. There was no one to tell her that her family was wrong, no one to question the strange rituals or the way her mother refused to let her look in mirrors for too long. Her only glimpses of the outside world came through the stories her father told at night, stories about sinners who wandered into the woods and never came back, about women who spoke against God and were turned into beasts by his wrath. Eliza absorbed it all, her mind shaped by fear and obedience. She believed her family was special, chosen to live apart from the corrupted world. But deep down, when the wind howled through the trees and the candles flickered low, she sometimes wondered if they were hiding from the world or if the world was hiding from them. Eliza's mother spoke of Samuel as though he were more than flesh and blood, as though something divine had chosen to live inside him. From the time Eliza could understand words, she was told that her brother was not like other men. Her mother would take her by the hand, lead her into the candlelit room where Samuel sat, and whisper that he was blessed by heaven itself. She said the Lord had spoken to her before Samuel's birth, telling her that a child would come to redeem their bloodline from sin. That child, she believed, was Samuel. To question his divinity was to question God, and in their house, that was a sin punishable by silence, fasting, and fear. Eliza watched her mother's eyes shine with a strange kind of madness whenever Samuel entered the room. Her voice softened, her hands trembled, and she would bow her head as though his presence alone demanded worship. As Eliza grew older, she began to notice the way everyone in her family moved around Samuel, cautious and obedient. Her father never raised his voice in his presence. Her mother referred to him only as the Anointed. Even her younger cousins, who sometimes came from nearby cabins, treated Samuel with uneasy reverence, touching his hands as if they might be healed by the contact. To Eliza, it was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. He was her brother, yet the house seemed to orbit around him like planets around the sun. When Samuel spoke, everyone listened. When he prayed, no one dared breathe. Samuel himself carried the belief with eerie calm. He never smiled, never laughed, but his words were soft and patient, filled with scripture and riddles that made little sense to Eliza. He told her that sin began in the blood, and only through purity could salvation be found. Sometimes he would place his hand on her head and say she was part of something eternal, something holy that outsiders could never understand. The more he spoke, the more his voice seemed to take on a rhythm that lulled her into believing him, even when a small part of her felt something wasn't right. Every night, their mother would light candles and make them kneel before Samuel. She would chant hymns that blended prayer with pleading, as though begging the heavens not to take him away. Eliza didn't fully understand, but she could feel the weight of faith pressing on her chest like a stone. Samuel's eyes would stay fixed on her during those prayers, cold and unwavering, and though her mother called him divine, Eliza sometimes wondered if holiness should feel so frightening. It began with whispers in the dark and the flicker of candlelight that stretched across the wooden floor. Eliza had always been told to stay in her room at night, to keep her eyes closed and her ears shut once the house went quiet. But curiosity has a way of gnawing at silence. One night, when the wind was howling outside and the walls seemed to hum with unseen life, she heard movement in the barn. Soft voices carried through the cracks in her window, rising and falling in a strange rhythm that didn't sound like prayer. She pressed her face against the glass, trying to see through the fog, and caught sight of a dim orange glow pulsing from inside the barn. Her mother and father were there, along with a few of the neighbors she rarely saw. And in the center of them all stood Samuel, his head bowed, his hands lifted as if commanding the air itself. The figures knelt around him, murmuring words she couldn't understand, a mixture of old hymns and something darker. The barn smelled of smoke and oil, the shadows moving in strange, jerking motions as the candles flared. Her mother was crying softly, whispering praises between gasps, while her father held a jar filled with what looked like blood. He poured it onto the dirt floor at Samuel's feet, and the others began to chant louder, their voices twisting into one long, desperate wail. Samuel raised his head then, his eyes catching the light. For a moment, Eliza thought he looked straight at her through the window. Her body froze as their eyes met, or maybe it was her imagination, but she could have sworn he smiled. After that night, the rituals became more frequent. Every few days, she'd wake to the low hum of voices drifting from the barn. By morning, the dirt outside would be disturbed, as though something heavy had been dragged through it. When she asked her mother about the noises, her mother would hush her and say Samuel was performing sacred work, something meant to keep their family safe. But Eliza began to notice the toll it took on everyone. Her mother's eyes grew hollow, her father's hands trembled, and Samuel seemed to change. His skin looked paler, almost translucent, and his presence filled the air with a heavy, electric charge. The more she watched, the more she realized that what happened in that barn wasn't worship. It was devotion turned into madness, a ritual that no longer sought God but something far more ancient and hungry. When Eliza turned 13, her mother's behavior shifted from distant affection to a kind of cold reverence mixed with dread. For weeks leading up to her birthday, her mother spoke in hushed tones with Samuel and her father, closing doors whenever Eliza came near. She could feel the tension humming through the house like a taut string ready to snap. Her mother avoided her gaze, her father prayed longer than usual, and Samuel began watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. On the morning of her birthday, her mother woke her before dawn, her eyes red from crying but her smile unnervingly calm. She handed Eliza a white dress that smelled faintly of candle wax and smoke, telling her it was time for her purification. Before Eliza could ask what that meant, her mother led her by the hand to the old shed behind the barn, a place she had always been forbidden to enter. The shed was small and windowless, its walls lined with wooden crosses and symbols carved deep into the grain. The air was thick with incense, heavy and suffocating. Her mother told her to step inside, saying the Lord's chosen must be made pure before she could serve Samuel. When Eliza hesitated, her mother's expression hardened. She whispered a prayer under her breath, pushed Eliza inside, and locked the door from the outside. At first, Eliza thought it was some kind of test, that her mother would return after a few minutes. But as the hours stretched into days, she realized no one was coming. There was no light except for a thin beam that slipped through the cracks in the wall. She could hear footsteps outside at night and voices chanting faintly in the distance, Samuel's name repeated again and again. Hunger clawed at her stomach, thirst burned her throat, and her mind began to twist with fear. She prayed, not knowing if anyone was listening. Sometimes she heard her mother's voice outside, telling her to be strong, to accept her role and not to resist what was coming. Other times, she swore she heard Samuel whisper through the wood, his voice deep and calm, telling her that purity required suffering. The longer she stayed locked inside, the more the world outside began to feel like a dream, and the shadows in the corners of the shed started to breathe with her. That was when she began to understand that this was not purification, it was preparation for something far darker. Inside the darkness of the shed, time lost all meaning for Eliza. The thin slivers of light that crept through the cracks no longer marked day or night, they only reminded her that the world outside continued without her. Hunger gnawed at her ribs until her body trembled, and thirst left her lips cracked and bleeding. But worse than the hunger were the sounds, the soft, rhythmic scratching that began on the third night. At first, she thought it was an animal trying to burrow beneath the floorboards. The noise came and went in uneven bursts, sometimes accompanied by faint thuds, as if something below the wood was shifting or crawling. She pressed her ear to the floor, her heart pounding, and heard what she thought were whispers. They were so quiet she almost convinced herself it was her imagination, until she heard her name. Eliza, the voice murmured, barely audible, stretched thin and fragile, yet hauntingly familiar. She froze, every muscle stiff. It was Samuel's voice, soft, calm, exactly the way he spoke when he read scripture to her as a child. "You're not alone," it whispered. "I'm with you." Her mind recoiled, refusing to believe it, yet the sound was too clear to dismiss. The scratching returned, faster this time, as though something beneath her feet was trying to reach her. She scrambled back into the corner, clutching her knees, whispering prayers through cracked lips. But the more she prayed, the louder the voice became, weaving words of comfort and command, telling her to stop fighting, to listen. By the fifth night, the whispers filled the shed. Sometimes they came from the floor, sometimes from the walls, and sometimes from the air itself. The voice spoke of destiny, of cleansing, of a bond that could not be broken by walls or locks. It told her that her suffering was sacred, that she had been chosen to continue what their bloodline began. Every word sank into her like poison, twisting her fear into a strange kind of longing. She began to doubt her own thoughts. Was Samuel really outside, speaking to her through the boards, or was he already inside, part of her mind? The line between reality and delusion blurred until she could no longer tell which was safer to believe. On the seventh night, she whispered back for the first time, her voice trembling as she asked what he wanted from her. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers, heavy and expectant, as if the whole shed was holding its breath, waiting for her to understand the answer that was already inside her. When the door finally creaked open, Eliza was too weak to stand. The smell of damp wood and candle smoke filled the air as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. Samuel stood in the doorway, holding a single candle that cast long, trembling shadows across his face. For a moment, he looked almost human, tired, pale, and solemn, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled her, a coldness that didn't belong to the brother she remembered. The flickering light gave his skin a ghostly sheen, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and melodic, the same voice that had whispered through the cracks. He told her she had been purified, that her suffering had made her worthy. She wanted to ask why he had locked her away, why her mother had abandoned her, but the words stuck in her throat. He reached out a hand, and though she wanted to shrink away, something in his gaze pulled her forward. Samuel led her back into the house, where every candle had been lit. The walls were lined with old family portraits, faces that looked eerily familiar, generations of eyes that seemed to follow her wherever she moved. In the center of the room stood their mother, weeping quietly, clutching a Bible so tightly the pages bent under her fingers. Samuel told Eliza it was time to accept her place in the holy order of their bloodline, that the Lord had chosen her for a sacred purpose. His words carried the weight of prophecy, spoken like scripture, yet his tone was intimate, almost tender. He said that purity could only continue through union, through blood unbroken and divine. Eliza didn't understand at first, not until her mother lifted her tear-streaked face and nodded in silent approval. The room seemed to tilt, her breath catching as she realized what Samuel meant. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body betrayed her. Samuel's presence was overwhelming, his voice soft, hypnotic, his touch cold as he brushed her hair from her face. He told her that their bond was chosen before their births, that God had made them one soul in two bodies. As he spoke, she felt something inside her break, a shattering that no prayer could mend. The candlelight flickered, and for a fleeting moment, his shadow stretched across the floor and merged with hers. It looked like one being tall, distorted, and wrong. In that instant, she saw the truth buried beneath his calm words and holy promises. There was nothing divine about what lived inside her brother. It was something far older, wearing faith like a mask, and it had already claimed her family long before she was born. Eliza waited until the night fell silent before she made her move. The candles had long burned out, and the only sound came from the rhythmic creaking of the old house as it settled into darkness. Her mother had fallen asleep in the next room, her murmured prayers fading into the night. Samuel was somewhere outside, his shadowy rituals stretching until dawn as they always did. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped from her bed, her bare feet soundless on the wooden floor. The air was heavy with the scent of wax and smoke, and every step she took felt like a betrayal against something watching her. She didn't know where she was going, she only knew she had to leave before the house claimed her completely. When she reached the back door, the latch stuck for a moment, and she nearly cried out in panic before it gave way with a groan. The cold air hit her like a slap, and for the first time in her life, she was outside without permission. The woods loomed around her, vast and silent, the moonlight barely filtering through the tangled branches. She stumbled toward the barn, thinking she might find food or water there, but her path veered when she noticed something strange behind the building, a row of small wooden crosses sticking out of the earth. At first, she thought it was a family cemetery, a place for long-dead ancestors, but as she stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. The names carved into the wood were faint, nearly erased by time, yet one name appeared again and again. Eliza. The dates were different, some from decades ago, some from years she hadn't even been born in, but every cross bore her name. She knelt beside the nearest one, her shaking fingers tracing the carved letters. Beneath her touch, the wood felt damp and soft, as though the ground itself had only recently been disturbed. A chill crawled up her spine as she realized what she was seeing. These weren't just graves, they were markers for her, or for the ones who came before her. Versions of her. Copies. The thought made her dizzy, her stomach twisting as she tried to make sense of it. How could she exist in so many years? How could they all bear her name? The moonlight flickered across the crosses, and in the shifting shadows, she thought she saw movement beneath the soil, a slow pulse like breathing. The air turned thick, and a single thought forced its way through her terror: she wasn't the first Eliza to live in that house, and if she didn't run, she wouldn't be the last. Eliza couldn't breathe as the truth began to sink in. Her name carved into the crosses wasn't a mistake, it was a pattern, a cycle that had been repeated long before she ever existed. Each cross represented another girl, another Eliza, who had lived and died believing the same lies. Her body trembled as she stumbled from grave to grave, reading the fading carvings by the weak moonlight. Some crosses bore crude etchings of a dove or a flame, symbols her mother often used when praying. The realization burned in her chest: her family hadn't been preserving purity or faith. They had been repeating it, generation after generation, remaking the same story, reshaping the same girl. Every daughter born to their bloodline had been named Eliza, raised in isolation, and given the same destiny: to serve Samuel, to believe he was divine, to be sacrificed for a purpose that was never holy. As the cold night air bit at her skin, Eliza's memories began to twist in her mind. She recalled her mother's trembling voice, the way she always said, "You are chosen," just as she was, and how Samuel would smile faintly whenever those words were spoken. The she her mother referred to hadn't been a saint or ancestor, it had been one of the other Elizas. Each time a child was born, the family remade the myth, trapping their daughters in a story they could never escape. Samuel was always there, unchanging, eternal in their eyes. But now, as Eliza looked back toward the house glowing faintly in the distance, a question tore through her fear. How could Samuel still be alive after all those years? Her mind replayed moments she had ignored before, the way her mother avoided talking about Samuel's childhood, the way he never seemed to age in the old photographs that lined the walls. Some of the earliest portraits looked identical to him now, his face untouched by time. He wasn't the son of her parents, at least not in any natural sense. He was something inherited, passed down, preserved through ritual and worship. The purity her family spoke of wasn't about holiness, it was about preservation, keeping Samuel's presence alive by repeating the same cycle. The graves behind the barn were the evidence of their devotion and their madness. Eliza stood among them, her breath fogging in the cold air, and for the first time, she felt the weight of every Eliza before her pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't living her own life, she was reliving theirs, caught in a bloodline that refused to die. Eliza ran into the woods with her breath ragged and her heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst. The cold branches tore at her arms as she stumbled through the undergrowth, driven by pure terror and disbelief. She didn't care where she was going, only that she had to get away from the graves, from the house, from Samuel. The forest was vast, endless, yet every path she took seemed to loop back to where she had started. The deeper she went, the thicker the air became, carrying with it faint echoes of her own name whispered from nowhere. It began softly, almost like the wind, but soon she recognized the voice. Samuel's. His calm, unshaken tone drifted through the trees, threading around her like smoke. "Eliza," it murmured, "you can't run from what you are." She froze, her pulse roaring in her ears as the sound seemed to come from every direction at once. The woods were alive with a kind of movement that wasn't natural. The trees groaned as if something beneath the earth was pushing against their roots. The shadows shifted even when there was no breeze, forming shapes that flickered and vanished at the edges of her vision. Each time she tried to orient herself, she saw the faint outline of the house through the branches, impossibly close, though she had run miles away. Panic clawed at her throat. No matter which way she turned, the forest twisted her back toward home. The path that should have led her deeper into the wilderness instead curved, folding upon itself until she found herself standing in front of the same crooked trees she had passed minutes earlier. The air grew colder, her breath visible in trembling clouds, and she began to hear faint humming, the same hymn her mother used to sing before prayers. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the melody only grew louder inside her head. When she stumbled forward, she saw flickers of movement in the distance, a tall figure standing between the trees, unmoving, watching. She didn't need to see the face to know it was him. The forest seemed to bend around his presence, the branches bowing toward him as if in reverence. Every instinct in her screamed to flee, yet her feet refused to move. Samuel's voice echoed again, softer this time, almost kind. "You were never meant to leave, Eliza. The blood remembers." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, and as she turned to run again, the forest shifted once more, guiding her path, pushing her forward until the trees parted. There, through the fog, she saw the cabin waiting for her, its windows glowing faintly, like eyes that had been watching her all along. Eliza's legs gave out as she stumbled back into the clearing, collapsing onto the frozen ground. The cabin loomed ahead, its faint orange light flickering through the cracks of the boarded windows. Every part of her screamed to turn back, to keep running until the forest swallowed her whole, but the pull of the house was stronger than her fear. It was as if the air itself was dragging her toward it, every breath she took heavy with the scent of smoke and decay. The door creaked open before she even reached it, swinging wide like it had been waiting. Inside, the candles burned low, casting the same uneasy glow she had seen 100 times before. Her mother's voice floated through the air, soft and broken, whispering prayers that no longer sounded holy. Eliza called out for her, but the sound that came back wasn't an answer. It was laughter, a hollow, echoing sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. When she stepped inside, The air turned colder. The portraits on the walls appeared to shift as she passed, their painted eyes following her every move. Her mother sat at the table, her body stiff, her face pale as wax, her lips moving in silent prayer. Eliza reached for her, but her mother's head lifted slowly, her eyes unfocused, and she whispered, "He's come back." Before Eliza could speak, she heard footsteps behind her, deliberate, steady, too familiar. She turned, and there he was. Samuel. His skin looked grey in the candlelight, his eyes hollow but burning with something that wasn't life. He smiled, the same soft, knowing smile that had haunted her since childhood. But now, she saw it clearly, the lines of decay beneath his skin, the faint shimmer of something moving beneath it, like worms twisting under flesh. He spoke her name, and the sound filled the room, vibrating through her bones. "You see it now," he said, stepping closer. "The others saw it too, before they became part of me." His words were slow and calm, but his voice carried the echo of 100 others, women, children, all whispering the same name. The truth clawed at her mind. Samuel wasn't alive. He hadn't been for decades. What stood before her was something wearing his face, a thing that had survived through their worship, feeding on their faith and their blood. As he reached out his hand, she saw the shadow of all the Elizas before her standing behind him, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. The candles flickered wildly, the air thick with the stench of rot, and Eliza realized the terrible truth: she had never escaped him, because Samuel was never meant to die. He was the curse bound to their blood, and she was the next vessel waiting to be claimed.